Israeli opposition leaders slam Netanyahu over Saudi-Iran deal. This is from PalestineChronicle.com. Israel opposition leaders slammed Prime Minister Netanyahu over the Saudi-Iran deal, Israeli media reported on Friday. Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to re-establish diplomatic ties on Friday after talks in Beijing between top security officials from the two countries. As a result of the talks, Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to resume diplomatic relations and reopen embassies within 2 months. Iranian news agency Islamic Republic News Agency, IRNA, reported. Commenting on this, Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid announced the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran reflects the complete and dangerous failure of the Israeli government foreign policy. Former Zionist defense minister and fierce critic of Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, stated, "The enormous security challenges facing the country are increasing, and the prime minister and his cabinet are busy with the coup d'etat." Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett added his view that countries in the world and the region are watching Israel in turmoil over the dysfunctional government that's engaged in systematic self-destruction. Bennett added that this is a resounding failure of the Netanyahu government and stems from a combination of political neglect with the country's general weakness and internal conflict. Press TV says, Iran-Saudi rapprochement, fatal blow to U.S.-Israeli project in region, Hezbollah. A high-ranking Hezbollah official says the restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a fatal blow to the American-Israeli project in the Middle East region. Sheikh Naim Qassem, the Lebanese resistance movement's deputy secretary general, made the remark in a post on his Twitter account on Saturday after Tehran and Riyadh agreed to re-establish relations and reopen embassies in Chinese-mediated talks 7 years after they'd severed ties. The return of Iranian-Saudi relations is an important turning point for the stability, security, and progress of the region, and it's the beginning of good things for their people and the peoples of the region. Qassem wrote this in an Arabic language tweet, and it's a fatal blow to the American-Israeli project and makes it more precarious, he said. Saudi Arabia served diplomatic relations with Iran in January 2016. After Iranian protesters enraged by the execution of prominent Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr Bakr al-Nimr by the Saudi government stormed its embassy in Tehran. The two sides had held 5 rounds of negotiations in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad since April 2022 to re-establish relations. Hamas, actions that anger Israel, a step in right direction. Meanwhile, the Palestinian resistance movement Hamas lauded the resumption of bilateral relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia as a desirable phenomenon that should be encouraged and supported. Any action that infuriates the Zionist enemy is a step in the right direction. This unity and accord is the desire of the nation in the region, or the nations in the region, and what political leaders should do is listen to the people's wishes, said Khalid al-Kadumi, Hamas's representative in Iran. Stressing that Palestine is the link between the components of the Islamic Ummah, Kadumi said Hamas expects the resumption of Iran-Saudi Arabia ties will usher in an era of dignity, pride, authority, and stability for the Ummah. Undoubtedly, stability in the relations between the components of the Ummah is to the benefit of Palestine because it's the only way to liberate Palestine and confront the Zionist regime as a common enemy of the Islamic Ummah, the Hamas official added. From Aram Online, Saudi deal with Iran worries Israel, shakes up Middle East. The news of the rapprochement between longtime regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran sent shockwaves through the Middle East on Saturday and struck a symbolic blow for Israel, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's made the threat posed by Tehran a public diplomacy priority and a personal crusade. The breakthrough, a culmination of more than a year of negotiations in Baghdad and more recent talks in China, also became ensnared in Israel's internal politics, reflecting the country's division at a moment of national turmoil. The agreement, which gives Iran and Saudi Arabia 2 months to reopen their respective embassies and re-establish ties after 7 years of rupture, more broadly represents one of the most striking shifts in Middle Eastern diplomacy over recent years. In countries like Yemen and Syria, long caught between the Sunni kingdom and the Shiite powerhouse, the announcement stirred cautious optimism. In Israel, it caused disappointment, along with a cascade of finger-pointing. One of Netanyahu's greatest foreign policy triumphs remains Israel's U.S.-brokered normalization deals in 2020 with 4 Arab states, including Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, part of a wider push to isolate and oppose Iran in the region. He's portrayed himself as the only politician capable of protecting Israel from Tehran's rapidly accelerating nuclear program and regional proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Israel and Iran have also waged a regional shadow war that's led to suspected Iranian drone strikes on Israeli-linked ships ferrying goods in the Persian Gulf, among other attacks. A normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, the most powerful and wealthy Arab state, would fulfill Netanyahu's prized goal, reshaping the region and boosting Israel's standing in historic ways. Even as backdoor relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia have grown, the kingdom has said it won't officially recognize Israel before a resolution to the decades-long Israel-Palestinian conflict. Since returning to office late last year, Netanyahu and his allies have hinted that a deal with the kingdom could be approaching. In a space to American Jewish leaders last month, Netanyahu described a peace agreement as a goal that we're working on in parallel with the goal of stopping Iran. But experts say the deal that broke out Friday has thrown cold water on those ambitions. Saudi Arabia's decision to engage with its regional rival has left Israel largely alone as it leads the charge for diplomatic isolation over Iran and threats of unilateral military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. The UAE also resumed formal relations with Iran last year. It's a blow to Israel's nation and effort in recent years to try to form an anti-Iran bloc in the region, said Yoel Gazonsky, an expert on the Persian Gulf at the Institute for National Security Studies, an Israeli think tank. If you see the Middle East as a zero-sum game, which Israel and Iran do, a diplomatic win for Iran is very bad news for Israel. Even Danny Danon, a Netanyahu ally and former Israeli ambassador to the UN, who recently predicted a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia in 2023, seems disconcerted. This is not supporting our efforts, he said, when asked about whether the rapprochement hurt chances for the kingdom's recognition of Israel. In Yemen, where the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is played out with the most destructive consequences, both warring parties were guarded but hopeful. A Saudi-led military coalition intervened in Yemen's conflict in 2015, months after the Iran-backed Houthi militia seized the capital of Sana'a in 2014, forcing the internationally recognized government into exile in Saudi Arabia. The Houthi rebels welcomed the agreement as a modest but positive step. The region needs the return of normal relations between its countries, through which the Islamic Society can regain security lost from foreign intervention, said Houthi spokesman and chief negotiator Mohammed Abdul Salam. The Saudi-backed Yemeni government expressed some optimism and caveats. The Yemeni government's position depends on actions and practices, not words and claims, it said, adding it would proceed cautiously until observing a true change in Iranian behavior. Analysts did not expect an immediate settlement of the conflict, but said direct talks and better relations could create momentum for a separate agreement that may offer both countries an exit from a disastrous war. The ball now is in the court of the Yemeni domestic warring parties to prioritize Yemen's national interest in reaching a peace deal and be inspired by the initial positive steps, said Afra Nasser, a non-resident fellow at the Washington-based Arab Center. Anna Jacobs, senior Gulf analyst with the International Crisis Group, said she believed the deal was tied to a de-escalation in Yemen. It's difficult to imagine a Saudi-Iran agreement to resume diplomatic relations and reopen embassies within a 2-month period without some assurances from Iran to more seriously support conflict resolution efforts in Yemen, she said. War-scarred Syria similarly welcomed the agreement as a move towards easing tensions that have exacerbated the country's conflict. Iran has been a main backer of Syrian President Bashar Assad's government, while Saudi Arabia supported opposition fighters trying to remove him from power. The Syrian Foreign Ministry called it an important step that will lead to strengthening security and stability in the region. In Israel, bitterly divided and gripped by mass protests over plans by Netanyahu's far-right government to overhaul the judiciary, politicians seized on the rapprochement between the kingdom and Israel's archenemy as an opportunity to criticize Netanyahu, accusing him of focusing on his personal agenda at the expense of Israel's international relations. Yair Lapid, the former prime minister and head of Israel's opposition, denounced the agreement between Riyadh and Tehran as a full and dangerous failure of the Israeli government's foreign policy. This is what happens when you deal with legal madness all day instead of doing the job with Iran and strengthening relations with the U.S., he wrote on Twitter. Even Yuli Edelstein from Netanyahu's Likud party blamed Israel's power struggles and headbutting for distracting the country from its more pressing threats. Another opposition lawmaker, Gideon Saar, mocked Netanyahu's goal of formal ties with the kingdom. Netanyahu promised peace with Saudi Arabia, he wrote on social media. In the end, Saudi Arabia did it with Iran. Netanyahu, on an official visit to Italy, declined a request for comment and issued no statement on the matter, but quotes to Israeli media by an anonymous senior official in the delegation sought to put blame on the previous government that ruled for a year and a half before Netanyahu returned to office. It happened because of the impression that Israel and the U.S. were weak, said the senior official, according to the Haaretz Daily, which hinted that Netanyahu was the official. Despite the fallout for Netanyahu's reputation, experts doubted the Detente would harm Israel. Saudi Arabia and Iran will remain regional rivals even if they open embassies in each other's capitals and Gazansky. And like the UAE, Saudi Arabia could deepen relations with Israel even while maintaining a transactional relationship with Iran. The low-key arrangement that the Saudis have with Israel will continue, said Umar Karim, an expert on Saudi politics at the University of Birmingham, noting that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank remained more of a barrier to Saudi recognition than differences over Iran. The Saudi leadership is engaging in more than one way to secure its national security. From Memo, Middle East Monitor, Netanyahu slammed by political foes over Saudi-Iran rapprochement. Israeli politicians use a surprising Saudi-Iran rapprochement to stage a severe attack on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli media reported on Friday. Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations on Friday after talks in Beijing between top security officials from the two rival countries. As a result of the talks, Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to resume diplomatic relations and reopen embassies within 2 months. And that's from IRNA. Commenting on this, Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid announced, the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran reflects the complete and dangerous failure of the Israeli government foreign policy. Former defense minister and fierce critic of Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, stated the enormous security challenges facing the country are increasing and the prime minister and his cabinet are busy with the coup d'etat. Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett added his view that countries in the world and the region are watching Israel in turmoil over the dysfunctional government that's engaged in systematic self-destruction. This is what happens when one deals with legal insanity all day, instead of doing one's job against Iran and strengthening relations with the United States. This delivers a fatal blow to efforts to build a regional coalition against Iran. Bennett stressed that this is a resounding failure of the Netanyahu government and stems from a combination of political neglect with the country's general weakness and internal conflict. From Al-Bawaba, Saudi-Iran deal worries Israel and sidelines the U.S. A China-brokered deal that's longtime regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran, ending years of estrangement, dealt a blow to Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose top priority is to confront Tehran's threat in the region and sidelines the United States, the only global superpower that traditionally engages in the Mideast's political intricacies. The breakthrough, announced in Beijing on Friday, is a culmination of more than a year of negotiations in Iraq and more recently closed-door discussions in China. The foreign ministers of both countries are expected to meet in the next few days to hammer out the details. Under the agreement, Iran and Saudi Arabia will patch up their 7-year split by reviving a security cooperation pact, reopening embassies in each other's countries within 2 months, and resuming trade, investment, and cultural accords. The deal comes at a time when tensions run high between the United States and its traditional Saudi ally over Washington's eroding security guarantees, over Iran's threat to Riyadh and other Gulf Arabs, and Saudi Arabia's decision to cut oil production to keep crude prices high during Russia's war in Ukraine. The U.S. welcomed the deal, John Kirby, National Security Council Coordinator for Strategic Communications, said in a briefing to reporters Friday. If this deal can be sustained, regardless of what the interest was or who sat down at the table, If it can be sustained and the war in Yemen can end and Saudi Arabia doesn't have to continually try to defend itself against attacks from the Houthis, who are funded and supported by Iran, in the end, we welcome that. For Iran, it's an opportunity to end its internal isolation and the international sanctions that have crippled the economy as the global community puts pressure on its regime to cooperate on the nuclear program, a thorn in the side of Israel, the U.S., and Sunni governments across the Mideast. Netanyahu, the hardline Israeli premier who took office in late December, pledged in his election campaign last year to curb Iran's influence in the region. In an article entitled Israel's Dangerous Shadow War Within Iran, Foreign Affairs said in the last few months, Israel's appetite for risks seemed to have increased. It pointed to purported Israeli attacks on Iran, such as one in early January when an Israeli strike on pro-Iranian militant groups inside Syria put the international airport in Damascus out of service. It said that later in January, reports indicated that Israel carried out a significant drone attack on a military site in the Iranian city of Isfahan. And last month, a considerable Israeli strike reportedly targeted Iran officials meeting in a residential neighborhood in Damascus. Riyadh's deal with Tehran could complicate Netanyahu's effort to normalize Israel's relations with Arab powerhouse Saudi Arabia. The Netanyahu government and U.S. President Joe Biden's administration have been trying to expand the 2020 Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia, which has been holding out, making demands both on Israel and the United States. Iran International quoted a senior Israeli official as saying the Saudi decision to reestablish diplomatic ties with Iran, severed since 2016, will not have an impact on the chances of Israel-Saudi relations. The official accompanying Netanyahu during his trip to Italy on Saturday and speaking on condition of anonymity, said that the Israeli government knew about the talks between Tehran and Riyadh for a long time and was following the process, according to Iran International. But Netanyahu's predecessor, Naftali Bennett, differed. He described the Saudi deal with Iran as harmful to chances of bringing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, pointing out that it's a serious defeat for the serving Israeli premier, Israeli media reported. Aside from regional considerations, the deal signaled a changing global order, according to analysts. It underlines the fact that the United States is no longer the only power with the final say in the region, said Riyad Qaisi, a Jordanian political science professor. Nevertheless, it's ironic that while the United States was encouraging Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni Muslim governments to go to war with the rival Shiite Muslim Iran to curtail its growing influence on the region, China brokered peace, he told Al-Bawaba, a sentiment voiced by many on social media. The Wall Street Journal said the restoration of diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh reflects the new reality. With Washington increasingly preoccupied in Ukraine and Asia, the region is trying to move past its old divisions, resolving conflict and easing tensions. And from Al Arabiya, Israel opposition sees Iran deal as Netanyahu failure. Restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran represents a failure of foreign policy by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his opponents charged on Friday. They said he's neglected the country's external relations to focus on domestic judicial reform, a project which has split the country and brought tens of thousands of protesters into the streets against what they see as a threat to democracy. It's a total and dangerous foreign policy failure of the Israeli government, opposition leader Yair Lapid said on Twitter, echoing the sentiments of other key opponents. 3 years ago, however, foreign policy was Netanyahu's triumph. He hailed a new era in relations between Israel and the Arab world, most of which views Israel as a pariah, when his country and the United Arab Emirates agreed to normalize ties. Under the U.S. brokered Abraham Accords, a similar deal was reached with Bahrain and later Morocco. Since the start of that process, Netanyahu never hit his ultimate aim, to bring the world's major Sunni Muslim power, Saudi Arabia, into the Accords as part of a regional alliance against Israel's enemy, Iran. That's not yet happened. Instead, Riyadh and its regional rival, Iran, on Friday said they'd agreed to restore ties and reopen diplomatic missions in a surprise Chinese brokered announcement. Contacted by AFP, Israel's foreign ministry had no immediate comment, but several opposition figures viewed the Riyadh-Tehran rapprochement as a failure for Netanyahu, the country's longest-serving prime minister. He returned to power in December in a coalition with ultra-Orthodox Jewish and extreme-right allies. It's a collapse of the regional defense wall that we began to build against Iran, Lapid continued. This is what happens when you're occupied all day by an insane legal project instead of handling Iran. Israel's entire political elite says they see an existential threat in Iran's controversial nuclear program. Tehran denies seeking to acquire an atomic weapon. Justice Minister Yair Levin, named to Netanyahu's cabinet in December, announced measures which would give more weight to the government in the committee that selects judges and would deny the Supreme Court the right to strike down any amendments to Israel's quasi-constitution. Netanyahu staged his comeback to head the government 18 months after his ouster following 12 continuous years in office. During his record term as premier, Netanyahu was a strong opponent of easing pressure on Iran. Former Defense Minister Benny Gantz accused Netanyahu and his cabinet of coup d'etat while the enormous security challenges confronted by the state of Israel increase. Rightist ex-Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, meanwhile, called the Iran-Saudi agreement a political victory for Iran, a fatal blow to efforts at building a regional coalition against it, and an astounding failure of the Netanyahu government. And from the cradle, Arab world hails Iran-Saudi reconciliation as Israeli leaders trade blame. While resistance leaders across West Asia celebrated the news, the Israeli government blamed the weakness of former officials and of the current U.S. government. Nations from across the Arab world are hailing the restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia after 7 years of tension. Following several rounds of talks hosted by Iraq, Oman, and China on 10 March, officials from the two West Asian powerhouses agreed to reopen their embassies and mission within the next 2 months. The return of normal relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia provides great capacities to the two countries, the region, and the Islamic world. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian tweeted on Friday, highlighting that President Ibrahim Raisi's Look East policy is strongly moving in the right direction. Israel was the only nation in West Asia where the announcement caused alarm. A senior official in Netanyahu's far-right government blamed the combined weakness of the previous Israeli government and U.S. President Joe Biden for the deal between Tehran and Riyadh. There was a feeling of American and Israeli weakness, so Saudi Arabia turned to other channels, the unnamed senior Israeli official told reporters traveling with Netanyahu in Italy. The same official also claimed that Israel's bid to normalize ties with Saudi Arabia will not be hurt by the restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What happens on the diplomatic level is not what happens under the surface, he said, according to Israel public broadcaster Khan and Reshet 13 News.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Meanwhile, former Israeli Premier Yair Lapid, who's been participating in mass anti-government protests over recent weeks, placed the blame for the deal at Netanyahu's feet. The agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran reflects the complete and dangerous failure of the Israeli government's foreign policy, Lapid said. And from Kashmir Life, Iran-Saudi agreement, why Israel opposition sees it as a dangerous development. As expected, the Tehran-Riyadh restoration of ties with Beijing's help has triggered a serious debate the world over, with most of the countries supportive of the agreement. A general perception is that the USA, the world's most powerful nation, has been sidelined by an emerging China. The most vociferous reaction has come from Israel, where senior opposition leaders have termed the agreement Tel Aviv's failure. The restoration of relations between the Saudis and Iran is a serious and dangerous development for Israel that represents an Iranian diplomatic victory. It represents a critical blow to efforts to build a regional coalition against Iran. Naftali Bennett, Israel's former prime minister, was quoted as saying by the Times of Israel, "This is a resounding failure of the Netanyahu government and is the result of a combination of diplomatic neglect, general weakness, and internal conflict in the country." Bennett was not alone. Yair Lapid, also a former prime minister, termed the agreement as a complete failure for Israel, calling it a collapse of our regional defensive walls that had been building against Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia, barely separated by a 150-mile distance, were representing two extremes in the Middle East. They were literally rivals in most of the conflict areas in the region. Besides, they were using Shia-Sunni sectarianism as part of their foreign policy in other Muslim countries. Israel, it may be recalled here, had normalized relations with Bahrain, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates in 2020. The agreement with Iran came as Tel Aviv was negotiating a relationship with Riyadh. While these efforts are likely to continue, the possibility of kicking Tehran out of the frame may not be possible. Israel sees Tehran as the enemy and dislikes its nuclear program, and Riyadh was almost thinking on the same terms. This has led to a sort of coalition with the Middle East excluding Iran. The agreement is expected to change that. Israel apart, the response from almost every other power center has been positive. Some Western countries, including USA and France, have responded to the development with a bit of caution. United Nations spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric expressed the gratitude of the United Nations Secretary General to China for hosting the recent talks, and the United Nations Secretary General welcomed the efforts of other countries in this regard, especially the Sultanate of Oman and Iraq. Saudi press agency reported this. The UN spokesman also stated that good neighborly relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are necessary for the stability of the Gulf region. In Brussels, the European Union has also welcomed the agreement. Generally speaking, we welcome any efforts to help end the war in Yemen and de-escalate tensions in the Middle East region. De-escalation and diplomacy, together with deterrence, are key pillars of the policy President Biden outlined during his visit to the region last year. U.S. NSA spokesperson John Kirby was quoted as saying this. The Saudis did keep us informed about these talks that they were having, just as we kept them informed on our engagement, but we weren't directly involved. When asked by reporters, Biden said better relations between Israel and the Arab neighbors are better for everybody. What's interesting, however, is that the agreement is being seen as the sidelining of the U.S. in this region. A general impression is that the U.S. was selling arms to fuel the conflicts in the region, and instead China used trade to get the rivals closer. The agreement's expected to have a cooling effect on at least three raging conflicts in the region. In Yemen, Iran was supporting Houthi rebels and Saudi Arabia was funding the exiled government. In Lebanon, Iran was backing Hezbollah and Riyadh money was surviving the Sunni political class. The two countries were the proxy players in Syria, where Iran supported President Bashar Assad, and Riyadh was closer to the so-called rebels. Analysts believe it's too early to predict a major shift as the parties will have to work on the agreement. The divisive political issues in the region have been played for such a long time that converting it into peace will take a long time. Those unhappy can contribute to making the agreement evaporate. And from Axios, senior Israeli official, Saudi-Iran deal result of U.S. weakness on Tehran. The agreement between Riyadh and Tehran to resume diplomatic relations is the result of weakness toward Tehran by the U.S., the West, and the previous Israeli government, a senior Israeli official told reporters on Friday. The big picture. The agreement announced Friday came after mediation efforts by the Chinese government, an achievement that sends a signal to the U.S. about China's role in the Middle East. What they're saying. There was a feeling of U.S. and Israeli weakness, and this is why the Saudis started looking for new avenues. It was clear that this was going to happen, the senior official told reporters traveling with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on his trip to Rome. The officials claimed that Saudis started talks with Iran in 2021 when they felt the U.S. was rushing for a new nuclear deal with Iran. Asked about the Israeli officials' comments, a White House National Security Council spokesman told Axios, "We remain committed to working closely with Israel to jointly address the many challenges and opportunities facing Israel in the Middle East region, including countering threats from Iran. There's no greater supporter of Israel's security than President Biden," the spokesperson added. The senior Israeli official who briefed reporters that the Israeli government's not concerned that the new Saudi-Iranian agreement will hamper the efforts to achieve a breakthrough that could lead to the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The official said that what matters is what's happening under the surface and not the diplomatic agreements.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
The U.S. and Israeli positions matter more than the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Western position towards Iran starts to change, but it still hasn't changed enough, the official said. And from Al Monitor, Israeli leaders trade accusations over Saudi-Iran rapprochement via China. An unnamed senior Israeli political official blamed foreign Prime Minister Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett Friday for the China brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, renewing diplomatic relations following criticism from the opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu government and missing opportunity to improve relations with Arab states. The official told Israel paper Ynet that its perception of weakness by Saudi of the Lapid Bennett governments and of U.S. that drew Saudi closer to Iran via China, The contacts between the countries started a year ago during the term of the previous government because there is a feeling of Israeli and American weakness. Weakness brings rapprochement with Iran, while strength pursues or pushes rapprochement away. It's important to form a strong position against Iran both in the U.S. and in Europe. The Israeli policy of preventing Iran from arming itself doesn't depend on the support of any country, he added, attempting to defend the Netanyahu, who has prioritized his own rapprochement with Saudi. According to the official, efforts will continue for an Israeli rapprochement with Riyadh. The contacts are frequent and the basic picture did not change. The stronger the Western position against Iran is, the less significant their relations with Saudi Arabia will be. Lapid's office rejected the accusation. It responded, "These are delusional statements. During the period of our government, an aviation agreement was signed with Saudi Arabia and the tripartite security agreement with Saudi Arabia and Egypt." He went on to fault Netanyahu for undermining relations with Washington. All of this came to a halt when the most extreme government in Israel's history was established here. And it became clear to the Saudis that Prime Minister Netanyahu was weak and the Americans stopped listening to him. Apparently, the Italian wine blurred Mr. Netanyahu's memory. Earlier on Friday, Lapid warned the Saudi-Iran agreement is complete and dangerous failure of the Israel's government foreign policy, or the Israeli government's foreign policy, attacking the coalition on its judicial overhaul plan. Lapid said, "This is what happens when you deal all day long with legal madness instead of doing what's needed to be done vis-a-vis Iran and instead of strengthening relations with the United States." Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett echoed Lapid's statement, saying, "The renewal of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a serious and dangerous development for Israel, a political victory for Iran, and a fatal blow to the effort to build a regional coalition against Iran. It's a resounding failure of the Netanyahu government, stemming from a combination of diplomatic neglect with general weakness and internal conflict in the country." Chair of the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, Yul Edelstein, said that the agreement is very bad for Israel and for the entire free world, adding, "The world does not stop while we are busy here with power struggles and clashes, certainly not our worst enemy." The news of the agreement came as Netanyahu was in Rome for his meeting with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, speaking with Italian business people before the publication of the agreement. Netanyahu said, "I think the possibilities will grow beyond imagination if we're successful with another goal that I have, and that's to achieve normalization and peace with Saudi Arabia. One of my central goals is to achieve normalization with Saudi Arabia." Netanyahu noted that the economic possibilities are obvious, such as a pipeline connecting Saudi Arabia and the Haifa port and into Europe. The Israeli press noted that Netanyahu's optimistic words before the publication of the agreement clearly showed he was out of the loop, and that the Saudi decision shows that Riyadh does not believe Israel has a viable possibility of striking the Iranian nuclear plans and destroying the Iranian nuclear program. Oh, wow, there's a connection that is just pretty drastic, and it's possible, but it's just like a bit of a stretch, logically speaking.
The whole notion of logic.
And here's Press TV on the matter.
Story regarding the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore ties. Iran says this will lead to a possible ceasefire in Yemen, as well as regional stability. Joining us is Esha Krishnas Wasmi, a podcaster and journalist from St. Petersburg. Esha, welcome. One of the things that this deal was, Oman tried, Iraq, of course, tried, but it was clinched by China. What's your take on that? When we rarely see China engage in diplomatic efforts to diffuse tensions beyond its own borders, but this does come on the backdrop of China's peace proposal for Ukraine, which was welcomed by both sides. So what's your take on that?
To avoid the mistakes made by the Soviet Union. I mean, maybe not mistakes, but more like when they were not completely able to take on the West to get involved in issues. And so they didn't really, they kind of stayed within themselves and let the West exert its hegemony. But since the new Belt and Road Initiative, and also since recently, where the US government has explained that it wants to engage in conflict with China in Taiwan, and they're also trying to surround China. Last year, for example, they tried a coup in Kazakhstan, and in Myanmar, of course, they had Anya Suu Kyi there. And so what I think is that China kind of finally is ready to assert its role as the leader in Asia. And of course, Iran is a very good ally, and Saudi Arabia has been is probably the strongest ally the US has ever had. And if they are able to distance Saudi Arabia from the US, of course, it is better for China in the long run, because the US has explained how it wants to be the aggressor against China and limit China's growth. And so I think this is just the next stage. And I personally see that this is a big step, because the Saudi Iranian diplomatic relations hasn't been was in 2016 when Sheikh Nimr got executed. They cut off diplomatic relations. So this is a very big first step. And of course, the biggest player in the Middle East who's going to feel the negative repercussions from this is Israel, who already explained that they're not very happy with this deal.
And in the 1 or 2 minutes that we have left, Aisha, so the U.S. is increasing as well, also tensions with China, with its military presence on Chinese shores, not the other way around, among other issues. Very quickly, is Beijing perhaps trying to break the U.S.-led world order, which is already on the decline?
Definitely. That's why they started the Belt and Road Initiative to help a lot of countries in Africa get out from under the hegemony. The biggest problem with the U.S. world order is, of course, the institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And China has been offering loans that are with much better terms to many countries, and helping them get out from under the IMF. And of course, there are US military bases everywhere. And because of China, for example, they were able to get, Djibouti was able to have a US military base leave. And that is a big step. And of course, yes, they are. And it is definitely something that is better for the majority of the world in the long run, because whenever the US comes, it always comes with austerity, privatization, poverty. And when countries try to assert their own independence, it's when the US comes with violence, like they did in Iraq or Libya. So definitely China understands what the situation is, and they planned for this for at least since 2014. And I just think this is the next step.